I'm pregnant with your husband's child, Emily whispered, her hand resting lightly on the back of Margaret Collins' chair as the family passed around a bowl of mashed potatoes at Sunday dinner. Margaret did not flinch. She did not spill her water. She simply set her fork down beside her plate and looked at the linen napkin folded neatly in her lap, as if Emily had just commented on the weather instead of dropping a sentence designed to shatter a room. The dining room smelled of roasted chicken and fresh rosemary, the same recipe Margaret had been making for nearly 40 years. The chandelier above the oak table cast a warm, steady glow over the familiar faces gathered there. Her son Daniel at the head of the table, talking about a new client. Her granddaughter Lily swinging her legs under her chair. Emily smoothing the fabric of her pale blue dress, as if nothing unusual had just occurred. No one else had heard the whisper. No one else knew that in the space between passing the gravy and refilling iced tea glasses, a quiet accusation had been delivered. Margaret lifted her gaze slowly and met Emily's eyes. There was no tremor in her voice when she asked, "Would you like more green beans?" Emily's lips curved into a small smile, one that did not reach her eyes. "No, thank you," she replied sweetly, then returned to her seat beside Daniel, her hand drifting casually to rest over her midsection. Daniel noticed the gesture and smiled, unaware of its layered meaning. Margaret observed everything. The way Emily avoided direct eye contact with her now. The way Daniel leaned closer to his wife, protective without knowing why. The faint tension beneath the polite clatter of silverware. Thomas had been gone for 8 months. 8 months since the funeral service at St. Mark's, since the folded flag, since the casseroles delivered by neighbors who spoke in hushed voices. Margaret remembered every hour of those last weeks, every hospital visit, every medication schedule written carefully on a notepad by the refrigerator. She knew dates. She knew timelines. She knew the quiet rhythm of her husband's final days better than anyone. So when Emily whispered that sentence, it did not land as truth. It landed as strategy. Margaret reached for her water glass and took a measured sip. Across the table, Lily asked if she could be excused to finish her homework. Daniel laughed about the Chicago Bears' chances this season. Life continued in its ordinary, almost comforting way. Only Margaret felt the shift, subtle but undeniable, like the first crack in ice before winter gives way. She studied Emily from the corner of her eye. The carefully chosen words, the softness of tone, the deliberate timing in the middle of a family ritual. It was not a confession. It was a test. Margaret had spent decades teaching high school English, guiding teenagers through Shakespearean betrayals and quiet manipulations hidden between lines of dialogue. She recognized subtext when she heard it. And in Emily's whisper, there was far more intention than emotion. Margaret folded her napkin, placed it neatly beside her plate, and offered her son a gentle smile. "Dinner was lovely," she said calmly. If Emily expected tears or outrage, or a scene that would fracture the evening, she would be disappointed. Margaret Collins did not crumble at a dinner table. She listened. She remembered. And she waited. After dinner, Margaret stood at the kitchen sink rinsing plates beneath a steady stream of warm water, while the low murmur of Daniel and Emily's voices drifted in from the living room, their tones soft, but layered with something she could not quite name, and she focused on the ordinary details, the weight of porcelain in her hands, the faint scent of lemon dish soap, the ticking of the clock above the refrigerator that Thomas had insisted on hanging 20 years ago, because ordinary details were anchors, and she had learned that anchors mattered when unexpected waves tried to pull a person off balance. She replayed the whisper in her mind not with shock, but with precision, measuring the timing, the location, the choice of words, and she noticed how deliberate it had been, not shared in private before guests arrived, or after they left, but exactly in the middle of a family ritual, when a reaction would have caused maximum disruption, and that realization settled into her chest with quiet clarity rather than panic. Daniel walked into the kitchen with 2 empty glasses and kissed his mother lightly on the cheek, thanking her again for dinner, his expression open and tired in the way it had been since his father passed, and Margaret studied him for a brief second longer than usual, searching for any hint that he knew what his wife had said, but she saw only fatigue and trust, which made her heart ache in a controlled, almost disciplined way. Emily followed a moment later, offering to help wipe the counter, her movements careful, her smile polished, and when their hands brushed reaching for the same towel, Margaret felt the faintest tension in the younger woman's fingers, not fear exactly, but anticipation. As if she were waiting for a response that had not come, Margaret handed her the towel without comment and dried her own hands slowly, her wedding band catching the light. A simple gold circle that had not left her finger in 48 years, and she thought about timelines again, about hospital calendars still tucked inside a drawer in her bedroom, about nights spent in a stiff vinyl chair beside Thomas's bed while machines hummed steadily, about discharge summaries and visiting hours written clearly in black ink. And she realized that memory was not fragile the way people assumed. It was structured, documented, almost architectural. When Emily mentioned a routine doctor appointment scheduled for next week, her tone light, Margaret nodded and said she hoped everything was progressing well, watching how the words landed, watching how Daniel's eyebrows lifted in surprise before he masked it with a smile. And there it was, the smallest crack in their shared narrative, because if Daniel had known, there would have been no surprise at all. Later that evening, after the car headlights disappeared down the quiet suburban street, and the house returned to its familiar stillness, Margaret walked through each room, turning off lamps one by one. Her footsteps measured on the hardwood floors, and she paused in the hallway outside her bedroom, glancing at the framed photograph of Thomas in his navy blazer taken at Lily's kindergarten graduation, remembering his steady gaze and the way he valued order above chaos, honesty above theatrics. She did not cry, she did not pace. She did not call anyone. Instead, she sat at her writing desk and opened a leather-bound planner where she kept important dates, flipping back 8 months, then 9, tracing her finger along neatly printed entries, hospital admissions, follow-up visits, physical therapy appointments, and she noted with quiet certainty that facts, unlike whispers, do not bend to emotion. Margaret closed the planner gently and turned off the lamp, understanding now that whatever game had begun at her dining table would not be won by outrage, but by patience, and she had always been very patient. The next morning Margaret woke before sunrise, as she had every day since Thomas fell ill, and she brewed a single cup of black coffee, carrying it to the small breakfast nook that overlooked her quiet backyard, where dew clung to the grass, and the maple tree he planted 30 years ago stood steady against the pale light. She did not rush her thoughts. She let them settle into order, and once again she returned to the calendar in her mind, to the hospital wing on the 3rd floor of Mercy General where Thomas had spent his final weeks, to the strict visiting hours, to the nurses who rarely left his side during critical days, and she calculated without emotion the space between reality and the claim whispered across her dinner table. By mid-morning, she pulled out a small storage box from the hall closet, the one labeled medical records, and laid its contents across her dining table with the same precision she once used to grade final exams. Each paper flattened carefully, each date read twice, and she saw clearly that during the period Emily implied, Thomas had been undergoing daily treatments that left him exhausted and confined to his room, rarely alone, always monitored. And Margaret felt not anger but confirmation, because facts had a way of standing quietly while stories tried to perform. Later that afternoon, Daniel called to ask if she could watch Lily on Thursday while Emily attended her appointment, and Margaret agreed without hesitation, listening closely to the way her son avoided specifics, the way he mentioned that Emily had been feeling tired lately, the way he paused before saying he hoped everything would work out, and she realized that Daniel was navigating something uncertain without knowing the full map. When Thursday arrived, Lily sat at the kitchen counter coloring a picture of a house with a large sun overhead, and Margaret asked gently if she was excited about becoming a big sister. And Lily looked up confused, saying she thought that was a surprise, that Mommy said it was not official yet, and Margaret absorbed that detail as carefully as she had absorbed every other one, because surprises in families are rarely accidental. That evening, after Lily was picked up, and the house fell silent again, Margaret opened her laptop and scheduled a meeting with the family attorney who had handled Thomas's estate, not out of fear but out of clarity, because she understood that words spoken in private sometimes aim at more than emotion. Sometimes they aim at inheritance, at legacy, at the careful distribution of assets Thomas had worked decades to build. She did not accuse. She did not speculate aloud. She simply organized, creating a folder labeled timeline on her desktop and scanning each document into digital form, building a quiet archive that required no raised voice to defend it. As the sun set and shadows stretched long across her living room floor, Margaret folded her hands in her lap and considered Emily's expression at dinner, that measured anticipation, that expectation of disruption, and she understood now that silence had unsettled her far more than outrage ever could have. Margaret Collins had no intention of reacting blindly to a whisper, but she would respond to it, and when she did, it would not be driven by emotion, it would be anchored in truth. 2 days before her scheduled meeting with the attorney, Margaret received a text message from Emily asking if she could stop by that afternoon to talk privately, and the phrasing alone told her that whatever had begun at Sunday dinner was now entering a new phase. Margaret agreed, setting the time for 3 o'clock, then spent the late morning tending to her garden, trimming back the rosebushes Thomas had planted along the fence line, because she believed in maintaining order in small spaces. When larger ones felt uncertain, and by the time Emily's sedan pulled into the driveway, Margaret had already decided she would listen more than she would speak. Emily stepped into the house carrying a bakery box from a local shop, offering lemon bars as a peace gesture that felt carefully selected, and Margaret thanked her politely, pouring iced tea into 2 tall glasses before sitting across from her at the same oak table where whispers had first landed. Emily began with gentle concern, saying she felt overwhelmed, that pregnancy was complicated, that emotions were heightened, and Margaret watched her closely, noticing how the narrative shifted slightly from accusation to vulnerability, as if testing which angle might provoke a reaction, and when Margaret remained composed, simply asking whether Daniel was aware of everything being said, Emily hesitated for a fraction too long before answering that he knew enough. The phrase lingered in the air, vague and elastic, and Margaret understood that ambiguity was being used as leverage. Emily then suggested that family legacy mattered, that names carried weight, that children deserved security, and the conversation drifted subtly toward estate planning without ever stating it directly, and Margaret felt the architecture of the situation forming more clearly. Now, because this was no longer about emotion, it was about positioning. She listened as Emily described upcoming doctor visits and expected due dates, details delivered with practiced softness, yet none of them aligned with the calendar Margaret had already reconstructed in her mind. And when Emily placed her palm against the table and said she hoped Margaret would support the child as part of the Collins family, Margaret folded her hands calmly and replied that support always follows truth, not assumption. There was no accusation in her tone, only steadiness. And for the first time Emily's composure flickered, just slightly, like a light struggling against a draft. After an hour Emily gathered her purse and thanked Margaret for understanding, though nothing had been resolved, and when the front door closed behind her, the house felt neither heavier nor lighter, only clearer. Margaret walked back to her desk and opened the digital folder she had created, adding a brief summary of the visit, recording exact phrases while they were fresh, because she knew that memory sharpened when preserved immediately. As evening settled in and the porch light clicked on automatically, Margaret realized that what Emily likely expected was either denial or collapse, but instead she was being met with documentation and restraint, when consistent, often unsettles those who rely on reaction. She sat quietly in the living room, hands resting over her wedding band, and allowed herself a single thought that was neither bitter nor fearful, only measured. Whatever story was unfolding would not be decided by whispers at a dinner table, but by facts laid plainly in daylight. On Monday morning Margaret drove to the office of Harold Bennett, the attorney who had handled Thomas's estate, the brick building standing 3 blocks from the courthouse with an American flag moving slowly in the late summer breeze, and she carried with her a neatly organized folder that contained copies of hospital records, printed calendar entries, and a written summary of her recent conversation with Emily. Harold greeted her warmly, offering coffee and expressing condolences once again for Thomas's passing, and Margaret appreciated the steadiness of his office, the shelves lined with leather-bound volumes, the quiet hum of an air conditioning unit set to 72 degrees, the faint scent of paper and ink. Because stability in physical spaces helped reinforce clarity in difficult conversations, she explained without embellishment what had been said at dinner and what had followed. choosing her words carefully, neither accusing nor dramatizing, simply presenting facts in chronological order, and Harold listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes while asking for specific dates, which Margaret provided without hesitation. When she finished, he leaned back slightly and said that claims involving paternity and inheritance required documentation, that assumptions carried no legal weight, and that any challenge to Thomas's estate would have to withstand scrutiny grounded in medical timelines and evidence. And Margaret felt a quiet confirmation settle over her, because this was precisely what she had anticipated. Harold suggested that if necessary, formal verification procedures could be requested in the future, but he also advised patience, noting that premature confrontation sometimes strengthens weak narratives rather than dissolving them. And Margaret agreed, understanding that reaction without strategy often plays into the hands of those seeking leverage. After the meeting, she returned home and placed the updated documents back into her organized file, adding Harold's business card to the front pocket. And she allowed herself a moment of reflection in the living room where sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting steady rectangles of light across the hardwood floor. That evening Daniel stopped by unexpectedly, saying he had finished work early, and he seemed restless, pacing slightly near the fireplace while asking whether Margaret and Emily had spoken again. And Margaret observed the strain in his posture, the way his shoulders tightened when she mentioned the word timeline, and she realized that doubt had begun to form in him quietly. Without her intervention, Daniel admitted that certain details about due dates had shifted in recent conversations, that Emily's explanations felt inconsistent, and Margaret listened without pressing, offering only that clarity benefits everyone in the long term, especially a child, because truth provides stability. Daniel sat down heavily on the sofa, running a hand through his hair, and for a moment, he looked less like a grown man with a mortgage and more like the boy who once asked his mother to check under the bed for imagined fears. And Margaret resisted the urge to comfort prematurely, choosing instead to let him process his own observations. When he finally stood to leave, he thanked her for remaining calm, saying he did not know how he would handle it if she had reacted differently. And Margaret simply replied that composure leaves room for facts to surface. After the door closed and the house returned once more to silence, she understood that the situation was shifting, not through confrontation, but through the steady weight of consistency. And she remained exactly where she had decided to stand from the beginning, anchored in patience, prepared for whatever documentation daylight would eventually reveal. By the end of the week, the air between Daniel and Emily had grown noticeably thinner, like glass stretched to its limit, and Margaret sensed the shift not through raised voices, but through small absences, unanswered calls, a Sunday dinner postponed with the explanation that Emily was feeling tired and needed rest. Margaret accepted the cancellation without comment and used the unexpected quiet to review once more the dates she had cataloged, confirming with calm certainty that Thomas had been admitted to intensive care on March 3rd and had remained under continuous supervision until his passing in early April, a period during which privacy had been nearly non-existent. And she allowed herself to remember those hospital corridors with their pale green walls and the steady beep of monitors, because memory grounded her in something real. On Tuesday afternoon, Daniel arrived alone, his expression drawn, and he asked if they could sit in the living room rather than the kitchen, a subtle sign that he did not want the conversation overheard by anyone who might later reinterpret it. And once seated, he admitted that he had confronted Emily gently about timelines, about medical realities, about how dates aligned, and her responses had shifted again, first suggesting uncertainty about exact weeks, then saying that stress might have affected her calculations. Margaret listened without interruption, noticing the way Daniel's confidence faltered each time he repeated her explanations aloud, as if hearing them spoken made their instability more visible. He said that when he asked directly whether she was absolutely certain about paternity, Emily became defensive, accusing him of doubting her integrity, and Daniel confessed that he did not know what to believe anymore. Margaret folded her hands neatly in her lap and reminded him that belief should never replace verification when legal and emotional consequences were involved, and she spoke not as a mother protecting pride, but as a woman who had spent decades teaching students to distinguish between narrative and evidence. Daniel asked whether she thought formal testing would be necessary, and Margaret replied that clarity protects everyone, including the child, and that avoiding truth rarely prevents pain, it only postpones it. Later that evening, Daniel left with a heaviness that Margaret recognized as the weight of realization, and she remained seated long after the door closed. Considering how quickly confidence can erode when inconsistencies multiply, she did not feel triumph, only a sober awareness that whatever Emily had attempted to construct was now under examination. 2 days later, Daniel called again, his voice steadier, saying that he had scheduled an appointment with a specialist to confirm timelines and options, and Margaret thanked him for choosing transparency, because transparency leaves little room for manipulation. When she hung up the phone, she walked to the hallway mirror and regarded her reflection, noticing the silver strands framing her face and the faint lines etched by years of responsibility, and she felt no bitterness there, only resolve. She understood now that silence had not been weakness but preparation, and as events continued to unfold beyond her control, she remained anchored in the one element that had not shifted from the beginning, the quiet strength of documented truth. The call came on a quiet Thursday afternoon while Margaret was folding freshly dried towels in the laundry room, and when she heard Daniel's name appear on her phone screen, she paused for half a second before answering, sensing that whatever he was about to say would move the situation from uncertainty into clarity. His voice was steady but stripped of the defensiveness that had colored it in recent weeks, and he explained that the medical consultation had confirmed discrepancies in Emily's timeline, that projected conception dates did not align with the period she had described, and that when presented with the findings, she could not offer a consistent explanation. Margaret leaned against the counter, listening without interrupting, noticing the absence of anger in her son's tone, replaced instead by quiet disappointment, the kind that settles deeper than outrage ever could. Daniel admitted that he had requested formal verification to remove doubt entirely, not because he wanted conflict, but because truth was necessary before any decisions about family, legacy, or responsibility could be made, and Margaret felt a measured sense of inevitability rather than shock, because she had understood from the beginning that facts would eventually require acknowledgement. He went on to say that Emily had reacted with frustration, accusing him of mistrust, yet she had also agreed to proceed, perhaps realizing that resistance would only intensify suspicion, and Margaret recognized the moment as the natural consequence of inconsistencies accumulating under scrutiny. After the call ended, she carried the folded towels upstairs and placed them neatly in the linen closet, performing the small domestic task with deliberate calm, because she believed that ordinary rhythms prevented extraordinary circumstances from overwhelming the mind. That evening, Daniel stopped by briefly, his posture straighter than it had been in days, and he told his mother that whatever the results revealed, he intended to address the matter directly and transparently, without allowing whispers or insinuations to dictate the narrative. Margaret observed the shift in him, the quiet strengthening that comes when doubt is replaced by resolve, and she realized that her refusal to react impulsively had given him space to reach his own conclusions. They sat together in the living room where late afternoon lights stretched across the carpet, and Daniel admitted that he felt embarrassed for having accepted vague explanations for so long, and Margaret reminded him gently that trust is not foolishness. It is simply vulnerable when placed in the wrong context. When he left, she stood by the window watching his car disappear down the street, understanding that whatever confirmation arrived next would not surprise her, because she had already seen the structural weakness in the story. She returned to her desk and added a final note to her growing file, recording the date and time of Daniel's update, not as evidence against anyone, but as a record of unfolding truth. And as night settled over the house and the porch light flickered on automatically, Margaret felt neither vindicated nor wounded, only steady, aware that the quiet strength she had chosen at the beginning was now guiding events toward clarity without a single raised voice. The results arrived on a gray Monday morning, delivered not with drama, but with a simple phone call that lasted less than 3 minutes. And when Daniel hung up, he did not shout or argue. He simply sat in his car for a long moment before driving to his mother's house, because some conversations feel steadier when held in rooms that have witnessed decades of truth. Margaret opened the door before he knocked, as if she had sensed the weight of the day, and she stepped aside quietly, allowing him to enter without questions. They sat at the dining table where so much had begun, sunlight filtering softly through the curtains, and Daniel placed a folded sheet of paper in front of him but did not immediately open it, his hands resting flat against the wood as though grounding himself. He said that the verification confirmed what the timelines had already suggested, that the child Emily was carrying was not connected to Thomas in any biological way, and that the narrative she had introduced had no factual foundation. Margaret listened without visible reaction, her posture straight, her expression composed, because this was not a moment for triumph but for clarity. Daniel explained that when confronted with the confirmed results, Emily shifted her explanation again, admitting that fear had motivated her earlier claim, that she had worried about financial security and had believed invoking Thomas's name would create leverage within the family. And as he spoke, the word leverage seemed to settle heavily between them. Margaret folded her hands over her wedding band and allowed a quiet breath to pass through her lips, not in relief, but in acknowledgement that intention had finally been named. Daniel's voice carried disappointment more than anger, and he said he had asked Emily to leave temporarily until they could decide how to move forward honestly, because trust fractured by manipulation cannot be restored through silence. Margaret reached across the table and placed her hand gently over her son's, not to console him, but to steady him, reminding him that truth, even when uncomfortable, builds stronger foundations than convenient stories. Outside, a delivery truck passed slowly down the street, ordinary life continuing without awareness of the quiet shift occurring inside the Collins home. When Daniel stood to leave, he looked older than he had weeks before, not from stress, but from understanding, and Margaret remained seated long after the door closed, gazing at the empty chair across from her. The whisper that once sought to destabilize her had instead revealed its own fragility, and in the stillness of her home, she recognized that composure had not only protected her dignity, it had guided the truth into daylight without a single raised voice. In the weeks that followed, the Collins home felt different, not fractured but recalibrated, as if invisible furniture had been rearranged, and everyone was learning how to move through the space again without colliding with old assumptions. Daniel filed for temporary separation, not out of revenge but out of necessity, explaining to Margaret that rebuilding trust required distance from manipulation, and she supported his decision without dramatizing it, reminding him that stability for Lily would depend on honesty more than appearances. Emily attempted one final conversation at Margaret's doorstep, standing beneath the porch light on a cool evening with folded hands and carefully chosen words, admitting that fear of financial insecurity had clouded her judgment and that she had believed invoking Thomas's name would secure her future. Yet Margaret listened without hostility, understanding that desperation often disguises itself as strategy. She responded calmly that security built on false claims cannot endure, and that the Collins legacy was not a bank account but a commitment to truth. And for a brief moment Emily's composure faltered, not from accusation but from the absence of it. There was no shouting, no public confrontation, only the quiet acknowledgement that consequences follow intention. Daniel later informed his mother that he would provide appropriate support for the child once born, because responsibility does not dissolve with disappointment, but he made clear that inheritance matters would remain untouched by fabricated narratives, and Margaret felt a steady pride in her son's balanced resolve. She spent her evenings organizing old photographs into labeled albums, preserving memories of Thomas without allowing his name to be used as leverage, and in doing so she reclaimed the narrative not through confrontation but through stewardship. Neighbors noticed little change beyond the absence of Emily's car in the driveway, and Margaret appreciated that discretion, because dignity thrives in quiet spaces. One Sunday afternoon Daniel and Lily joined her for lunch, laughter returning in small, careful increments. And when Lily asked why adults sometimes tell stories that are not true, Margaret answered gently that fear can confuse people, but truth has a way of finding its footing, as sunlight filtered across the dining table. Margaret understood that the whisper that once sought to destabilize her had instead revealed the resilience of her composure, and she remained exactly where she had chosen to stand from the beginning, anchored not in reaction, but in steady, documented truth. Autumn arrived quietly in the neighborhood, the maple leaves along Margaret Street turning shades of amber and deep red, And with the shift in season came a steadier rhythm inside the Collins family, one built less on speculation and more on decisions made in daylight. Daniel finalized temporary custody arrangements for Lily and established a clear financial plan that accounted for the future without bending to false claims. And he did so with measured calm, consulting professionals rather than reacting emotionally, a choice Margaret recognized as growth rather than retaliation. The legal paperwork moved forward in neutral conference rooms with muted carpeting and polished tables, where voices remained civil and facts carried more weight than accusations, and Margaret attended one meeting at Daniel's request, not to intervene, but to observe, sitting upright with hands folded neatly in her lap, while attorneys clarified timelines that were now firmly documented. Emily appeared, composed but subdued, her earlier certainty replaced by careful phrasing, and when inheritance was mentioned, the conversation remained grounded in previously established estate plans that had been drafted long before uncertainty entered the picture. Margaret did not speak often, yet when she did her words were precise, reaffirming that Thomas's wishes were already recorded in legally binding documents, and that no sudden narrative would alter what had been structured with intention. Afterward, Daniel thanked her for her presence, admitting that seeing her steady posture across the table had reminded him that stability can exist even when relationships shift. Back at home, Margaret continued sorting through family records, placing original documents into a fireproof box in the hallway closet, not out of suspicion but out of responsibility, because clarity deserves preservation. On a crisp Sunday afternoon, she invited Daniel and Lily for lunch again, setting out simple dishes of roasted vegetables and grilled chicken. And the conversation remained light, focused on school projects and upcoming holidays. Yet beneath the surface there was an unspoken understanding that truth had redirected the course of events. As sunlight filtered across the dining table and laughter returned in softer tones, Margaret realized that the quiet strength she had chosen months earlier had reshaped more than a single confrontation. It had redefined the boundaries of her family. There had been no dramatic exposure, no public spectacle, only documentation, patience, and a refusal to allow whispers to dictate reality. And in that restraint, she found not only dignity, but control, the kind that does not announce itself loudly, yet remains unmistakably firm. Winter settled gently over the neighborhood, frost outlining the edges of Margaret's windows in delicate patterns each morning. And with the colder air came a quieter acceptance of what had unfolded inside the Collins family. Not dramatic or loud, but definitive. Daniel finalized the separation, choosing a structured arrangement that protected Lily's routine while allowing space for reflection. And he spoke to his mother one evening at her kitchen table about how easily confidence can be redirected when fear is disguised as urgency, admitting that he had ignored early inconsistencies because he wanted peace more than clarity. Margaret listened as she always had, her hands wrapped around a warm mug of chamomile tea, the steam rising steadily between them, and she reminded him that peace built on avoidance rarely lasts, while peace built on truth requires courage at the beginning but steadiness afterward. Emily moved into a small apartment across town, and although she reached out occasionally with practical questions about shared finances, the tone of her communication had shifted from assertive to restrained, and Margaret responded politely, but without invitation for emotional negotiation. There were no scenes, no public accusations, only paperwork filed properly and conversations held within appropriate boundaries. One Saturday afternoon, Daniel brought Lily over to help decorate for the holidays, and as they untangled strings of white lights, Margaret watched her granddaughter laugh at a knot that refused to cooperate, and she realized that the family's foundation had not collapsed. It had simply been tested. Daniel later admitted that he felt relief not because conflict had ended, but because uncertainty had, and Margaret nodded, understanding that clarity often feels heavier at first but lighter in the long run. She had never needed revenge, only verification. And in choosing composure over confrontation, she had preserved not only her dignity, but her influence. As evening fell and the tree lights cast a soft glow across the living room, Margaret stood back to admire the quiet warmth of the scene, aware that whispers lose their power when faced with patience. The season outside was cold, yet inside her home there was steadiness, the kind that does not rely on dramatic declarations, but on the simple strength of standing firm when a story attempts to rewrite itself. And in that steadiness, she understood that the most decisive response had never been a raised voice, but an unwavering commitment to truth. By early spring the air had softened, the snow long melted into clear sidewalks and budding trees, and Margaret found herself opening the windows of her home to let in a breeze that felt lighter than the months before, not because hardship had never come, but because it had been met with steadiness rather than spectacle. Daniel's life had settled into a new rhythm, structured custody arrangements in place, financial responsibilities clearly defined, and conversations with Emily now limited to practical matters handled through respectful distance. And while there were still moments of sadness when Lily asked why families sometimes change shape, those questions were answered with honesty rather than avoidance. Margaret spent her mornings tending to the garden again, kneeling carefully beside the rosebushes Thomas once planted, trimming back winter damage, and watching new green shoots push through branches that had appeared lifeless only weeks earlier. And she saw in that quiet renewal a reflection of her own journey. Nothing dramatic had saved her reputation. No confrontation had restored balance. Instead, it had been documentation, patience, and the refusal to react impulsively that preserved both dignity and influence. One afternoon, Daniel joined her outside, sleeves rolled up, helping secure a loose section of fencing that winter winds had weakened. And as they worked side by side, he admitted that he once believed strength meant defending loudly, but now understood that strength often means standing firm long enough for truth to surface on its own. Margaret smiled gently, brushing soil from her gloves, and told him that composure is not silence. It is control over when and how one chooses to speak. Later that evening, they shared dinner at the same oak table where uncertainty had once attempted to fracture trust, and the conversation was simple, centered on Lily's school recital and upcoming summer plans. Yet beneath the ordinary details there was a quiet acknowledgement that the family had been tested and had not collapsed. Margaret kept Thomas's framed photograph on the mantel, not as a symbol of vulnerability, but as a reminder that legacy is protected through integrity rather than fear. She had never needed to raise her voice to defend his name, because the truth had carried more authority than any accusation could. As twilight settled and the house grew still, Margaret turned off the lights one by one, pausing briefly in the hallway where echoes of past conversations had once lingered, and she recognized that the whisper meant to destabilize her had ultimately revealed her own resilience. She had not fought for control, she had simply refused to surrender it. And in the calm that followed, she understood that dignity maintained quietly often reshapes a family more permanently than confrontation ever could, leaving behind not noise, but clarity, and a legacy grounded firmly in truth.